Hello, one and all. Bienvenue à tous. If you're turning in live, thanks for making the time for us in your busy day. If you're watching this on YouTube, thanks for stopping by. Whichever way you're watching, welcome to Postmedia's fourth season of Driving into the Future. I'm David Booth, and I'm the senior writer for Driving.ca. Today, Driving into the Future will try to answer the most important automotive question of this, or probably any other generation. Officially called the proposed light-duty zero-emission vehicle regulations. By any other name, it's a ZEV mandate. Essentially, it will require that by 2035, all light-duty passenger vehicles, that's cars, pickups, and SUVs to you and me, will have to put out no tailpipe emissions. Along the way, there are also targets. 60% of the vehicles sold by any manufacturer in 2030 will have to meet zero-emission vehicle standards, for instance, or they will face stiff penalties. So far, all the effort in this transition has been focused on electric vehicles. But are EVs the only solution to the automotive industry's greenhouse gas problems? Are all vehicles best turned green by batteries? Can hydrogen-powered fuel cell vehicles have an impact in our quest for greener automobiles? Can hydrogen be burned in an internal combustion engine and not emit carbon dioxide? And exactly what are synthetic fuels? The artificial gasoline that the European Union, to everyone's great surprise, recently approved that will allow internal combustion engines to be sold past 2035. Last, but most certainly not least, will we have enough clean and green electricity and the infrastructure to transmit it to support the cars of the future? To help us answer all these questions, again, the most pressing of this or any other generation, we're joined today by a truly august panel of experts. Stephen Beatty, Vice President Corporate of Toyota Canada, Francis Bradley, President and CEO of Electricity Canada, Daniel Breton, President and CEO of Electric Mobility Canada, and Karl Dums, Manager of Politics and Governmental Affairs for Porsche AG. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us today. Before we start the proceedings, let me welcome all our viewers and inform you that we will be trying to answer some of your questions later in the discussion. So, gentlemen, what a truly exciting time to be in the automotive industry. We are in the midst of the biggest revolution in mobility since the birth of the automobile. The road to zero emissions is hugely ambitious, and since we're only likely to get one chance at building an all-new infrastructure, we need to get it right. Daniel, I'm going to start with you, mainly because I think you may have had a little input into the proposed Canadian ZEV mandate. Why don't you walk us through it? What's the purpose of these new regs? What will be the rules and how will they be enforced? Basically, can you give us the 5-minute version of what this proposal means for Canada?
Thanks a lot, David. Thank you for inviting me and to have EMC have a voice in this conversation. Well, first of all, I would like to explain what a ZEV is, what a zero-emission vehicle is, according to the Californian government, the Canadian government. A ZEV is either a battery electric vehicle, a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, or a hydrogen vehicle. So when you're talking about hydrogen technology, well, hydrogen cars are part of what we consider to be a ZEV. The question is, why do we need a ZEV mandate or a ZEV sales regulation program like the government wants to call it? Well, first of all, it's to lower GHG emissions and increase zero-emission vehicle supply. You have to keep in mind that in 2005, there was a voluntary agreement with car manufacturers to lower their GHG emissions, but because it was a voluntary agreement, we missed the target by 95%. I'm sure you've heard about that. According to the International Energy Agency, Canada's light-duty vehicle fleet was dead last of any country in the world for average fuel consumption at GHG emissions per kilometer driven. So for years, some OEMs, not all of them, have said that we did not need a ZEV sales regulation program because if demand was there, supply would follow. I remember I was part of the conversation with the ZEV sales regulation in Quebec, and back in 2016, that's what some manufacturers were saying. Now, some manufacturers are saying, well, we cannot have regulation like that because if the demand is there, the regulation is there, they won't be able to meet demand. So while the government is aiming for 40 to 45% GHG emission reduction between 2005 and 2030, actually the light-duty vehicle fleet GHG emissions have increased by 8%. And when you're talking about light-duty trucks, it has increased by 40% between 2005 and 2019. So if you look at what's being proposed right now by the federal government, according to the proposed regulations, car manufacturers will have to reach 20% ZEV sales by 2026. Just for information, during Q4 2022, we were at 10.2% across Canada. So we need 60%, as you mentioned, by 2030, 100% by 2035. If a company exceeds its ZEV sales targets, it earns compliance units for excess ZEV units offered for sale. If a company misses its ZEV sales target, it incurs a compliance deficit, which must be satisfied by obtaining credit. Compliance credit can be satisfied with bank credits, by purchasing credits from another company, like we are seeing in Quebec or BC, or by creating credits from contributing to designated ZEV activities. A battery electric vehicle or a fuel cell vehicle or a plug-in hybrid vehicle with an all-electric range of more than 80 kilometers, according to what's being proposed by the government right now, would receive 1 credit, and a PHEV with an all-electric range of less than 80 kilometers would receive a portion of a credit. The regulated companies would earn one compliance credit for each contribution of $20,000 and indexed annually to the consumer price index. So we could go, there are a lot of details into this regulation, but fairly simply is if you sell enough cars, you get compliance credits. If you don't sell enough, you either have to buy or exchange credits. So what we at EMC have said, because there are some issues with what's being proposed by the government, is the fact that if you live in BC or Quebec, you could get double crediting, meaning that there are regulations in Quebec and BC. And right now, what we are seeing is that the government wouldn't mind the fact that the manufacturers could basically use the credit both for Quebec and the federal level, meaning that Quebec and BC consumers would have, I would say, a favorable access to electric vehicles in those provinces, which means that other provinces who might have rebates would not be able to get them as quickly because they don't have the same crediting system. So we think that regional distribution should be allocated to make sure that Atlantic Canada, the prairies, would get EVs as well. We think that penalties for non-compliance. Right now, there are criminal sanctions under SEPA is the legal enforcement, but we think that we need to find a way for companies to have to pay a penalty. So we are proposing that we have a credit clearance mechanism as a last resort to make sure that we have a predictable financial consequence for non-compliance. The credit lifespan, we think that the credit lifespan should be, which can be banked, should be limited to 3 years. And we think that we should reduce credits and compliance caps for PHEV sales. All in all, we are in favor of the ZEV sales regulation program as presented by the federal government, but we think that there are some loopholes in it. One of them being the fact that ZEV-related activities, since they have not been defined, could be anything. So let's say you want to bring your cars to an EV show. Well, do you get credits for that? This is something that we don't have an answer to yet. So these are my opening remarks.
Thanks very much for that explanation, Daniel. Stephen, your company is lobbying the government to enforce a greenhouse gas emissions reduction rather than the mandating of the sale of zero emission vehicles that Daniel just described. I believe that you're offering to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions of Toyota's entire fleet by a similar 60% by 2030. How would that work? And why do you think that's a better solution than simply making ZEVs mandatory?
Well, let me just answer the second question first. I think Danielle's done an excellent job of explaining the complexity of a ZEV mandate. And quite frankly, back when Quebec introduced their ZEV mandate, I went to Quebec and said, I think you're on the wrong plan. And I expect in the early years of a ZEV mandate, you'll actually see carbon emissions from the fleet grow. I was told by Quebec at the time that was an unlikely scenario, but in fact, that's exactly what happened. And so the issue, I think, as between Danielle and me, isn't about the outcome. I think we both want to drive out carbon emissions from the on-road fleet. The issue is, how do you get there? And when we look at the federal ZEV mandate, it never actually gets you to zero emissions. It gets you to a future where 20% of your fleet can be the plug-in hybrids that Danielle's talked about. But because we've separated cars from the energy they run on, you're not ever closing the loop in terms of the carbon emissions from transportation. So I know you'll get into this later on, but e-fuels and all sorts of other technologies are going to be important, I think, if we're going to be able to meet that carbon-free future. In any event, for right now, my view is this: if we have a scenario where we're trying to drive out carbon emissions as soon as possible and as effectively as possible, you want to make sure that you're looking at the carbon averages out of the entire fleet at the same time, and moving as quickly as you possibly can to take old technologies out of the market and replace them with newer, more efficient technology. You also want to understand, I think, that this is a revolution that ultimately requires the consumer to be a partner with us in making it happen. And we won't get to those targets if customers aren't prepared to buy the technologies that we're offering. And so that means that we not only have to have the infrastructure and supply chains in place to be able to build and support the vehicles of the future, but it means in the meantime that affordability and choice become important issues for consumers. If you focus simply on outcome, but let the technologies compete against each other, you get the lowest cost outcomes for the consumer, and you'll get the fastest reductions in carbon emissions. But if you start playing with the details of regulation, as so often happens, then you build in loopholes, things don't happen, or you get perverse outcomes, as we currently do with the federal GHG rule, where vehicles actually became bigger and heavier and less economical in terms of their total energy use. So focus on the GHG emissions, you'll get to the right outcome, and you'll do it fast.
Okay, thanks a lot, Stephen. Good counterpoint. Karl, your company, Porsche, is exploring the benefits of synthetic fuel. To start us off on this, can you explain to us what synthetic fuel is, how is it made, and why should we consider it as fully green?
Yeah, David, thank you for these questions. To be precise, we deal with synthetic fuels which are produced with the help of renewable energy, because you can also produce it with fossil energy. So, but this is not where we are heading on. We call it e-fuels, and it's made out of hydrogen, carbon dioxide, out of the air, and renewable energy, and this is needed for the production. The energy can be hydropower, wind power, or solar power. And with the hydrogen and the CO2, we can produce e-methanol in the first step, which is already a liquid energy carrier, and we can easily transport or store it. And in the second step, we produce raw gasoline with a so-called methanol to gasoline process. And this fuel can already be used as a kind of drop-in fuel to replace fossil gasoline. And if you want to use it directly in the car, you have to do a little upgrade to meet the current specification at the fuel station. When the fuel is burned, we will emit not more carbon dioxide than we captured before when we produce it. And therefore, we have a kind of a carbon cycle, but we anyway talk about almost CO2 neutral, because the carbon footprint of the production facility has also been taken into account. But this has also been done in the case of producing renewable electricity.
So basically, if I'm understanding it correctly, a car running on synthetic fuel still puts out carbon dioxide, but all the carbon dioxide it puts out has been previously scrubbed from the atmosphere. So it's basically net zero. Is that correct?
Exactly. So what we are producing is still hydrocarbons, and it's in the same in the same condition like the fossil fuel. There is basically no difference from the chemical point of view, but what we do is the hydrogen is green. The hydrogen which is used in these hydrocarbons is made out of water. It's green hydrogen, and the CO2 is for the use. It's filtered out of the air, so that we have renewable components, and then we have this carbon cycle.
Oh, that's a great explanation. Thanks very much, Karl. Francis, a lot of people are wondering whether we can produce enough electricity to power all the electric cars of the future. I noticed in your submission to the government regarding these new rules that the proposal's regulatory impact analysis statement, that's a mouthful, thinks that that there will be just a 4.8% increase in electrical demand by 2050 as the result of electric vehicles. On the other hand, you also say that Natural Resources Canada says the number might be as much as 22.6%. So which is it? I mean, a 5% increase does seem a little low to power what, about 28 million electric vehicles that will be on the road in 2050?
Yeah, thank you for that, David. So which is it? Listen, we're in this instance we're projecting out to 2050 here. So I think I can safely assure you that it will be neither of these. It is, let's face it, it's a bit of a mug's game to project the actual change in demand 9,768 days into the future. But questioning the assumptions in models, it's all part of the regulatory consultation process. We also said something else in that submission. We said the federal government must continue to support and fund electricity projects. Now, this is important because 2 weeks after we put in this submission, we had the federal budget that came down, which essentially signals that electricity is a public good, and it's something that the federal government is indeed willing to fund in a big way. So, make no mistake, this is a game changer. Meeting our greenhouse gas emissions targets is absolutely possible, and we're working with governments to get there. But to get there, we need to move quickly in some key areas. At the federal level, we need clear rules around decarbonization, and we need a way to move through the project permitting and approval processes to ensure that good projects get built. We need to do it on timelines that meet our goals, and we need to continue support to make sure that we can keep electricity affordable for customers. So these issues were addressed in last week's federal budget, and it signaled that these things are achievable, and it was a transformative budget that I think will help us meet the goals of decarbonizing the electricity grid and the Canadian economy while addressing affordability for electricity customers and preserving reliability. But the work isn't done yet, but we can achieve it. And after last week, I think we're moving in the right direction. Prior to the federal budget, when I was asked, where are we on the path to the energy transition, to use a car analogy, as somebody who drives with a stick, I would say we were in standard, we were in neutral. I think we've moved into second gear, but we still have a long way to go.
Okay, thanks. A quick follow-up, Francis. I don't know much about electric grids at all, but what I do know is that you don't build for average loads. To prevent the brownouts, you need to plan for peak usage. For car drivers in Canada, that's Labor Day, when everyone is filling up basically at the same time. Heck, service stations on Ontario's 401 have lineups for hours, and they have 16 pumps. What will those peak rush hours do to our grid, and how do we prepare that infrastructure for the peak, not the average loads?
No, a really good question. But first off, like lineups for hours, I guess I'm lucky I don't drive on the 401 as much. I haven't seen lineups for more than a few minutes since 1973. But I know this is a driving event, so if you're lining up for hours, you might be thinking about doing something other than lining up for hours to do that. But seriously, the issue is what are the processes for electricity companies in Canada to plan and to build the infrastructure that's going to supply customers with clean, reliable, and affordable power. So if you look at jumping back, look at the end of the 19th century, the greatest environmental concern we had at the time was manure. Experts were predicting that New York would be buried in manure from the millions of horse car trips that were taken throughout the city. And London faced this manure crisis of 1894, but the rapid adoption of the automobile completely changed that paradigm. You know, that the adoption of the automobile was a great example of Wright's law that states that the cost of a unit decreases as a function of cumulative production, which is a fancy way of saying that the market has a way of adapting to rapid shifts in technology. And the cars, they're not all coming all at once. We're not going to wake up one day next week and everybody has an EV in their driveway and every single car is going to have to charge up. There was a time when it was a lot easier, for example, to find a place to get a horseshoe than it was to buy gas. And when more cars replaced horses, we adapted. You know, even into the 2040s, internal combustion vehicles that were bought before 2035 are still going to be on the road. So it is a gradual transition that we're heading towards. And, you know, my Jeep Wrangler is a dozen years old, but I plan on driving it for a dozen more summers at least, and probably beyond 2035. So we're looking at something that will be far more gradual in terms of its rollout.
Okay, thanks for that, Francis. Daniel, the major criticism of a ZEV mandate is that it gives some automakers an advantage. I did some back of the napkin calculations and figured out that an automaker, let's just pretend it was one of Detroit's big three, could make the proposed 60% ZEV deadline by 2030, but because of the remaining gas-guzzling ICE-powered cars in its fleet, not have cut its CO2 emissions by 60%. Is that not a reason to force companies to cut greenhouse gases specifically rather than mandating ZEVs?
Actually, it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both. So where I agree with Stephen is the fact that this footprint regulation, to me, makes no sense because it's creating a huge loophole. And you're right, Stephen, when you mentioned that. But where I'm a bit concerned is the fact that many traditional car manufacturers are saying that Canada, instead of following its own ZEV sales regulation pathway, should align with the US EPA regulation that's going to be out anytime soon. So if we have the same loophole in the US, will we replicate the loophole in Canada, which will create the same problem? So that's why we say that we agree with the fact that we have to have some GHG emission regulation, but we think that ZEV sales regulation as well will enforce it to make it faster and more efficient. You know, when Stephen mentioned the fact that, you know, GHG emissions in Quebec increased in the first few years of the regulation, even though there were more electric cars on the road, it's because there's actually more gas cars that have been added to the fleet than the all of electric cars in the same period. So that's another topic. But to me, the point is that we have to make sure that we keep in mind, because Francis, I'm surprised you didn't mention this, but 83% of Canadian electricity production right now is non-emitting. And we are aiming to 100% renewable or non-emitting by 2035, which means that if you buy, I would say, more efficient gas vehicles between now and 2035, they will still keep emitting between now and 2035, even though they are more efficient. If you buy more and more electric cars, if the grid gets closer and closer to zero emission, what we'll have is will be a lot cleaner fleet of cars on the road in Canada than just by working with GHG emission regulation. So to me, we don't need one or the other, we need both. And close the loophole. I agree, Stephen.
Okay, so Stephen, I understand your concern for the efficient reduction of CO2 during the transition to zero emissions, but aren't proponents of the ZEV mandate correct in pointing out that come 2035, all vehicles will have to meet zero emission standards, whether we mandate ZEVs or progressively reduce the allowable carbon dioxide emissions to zero? Aren't we splitting hairs a bit here?
No, because in fact, what's happened is if you look at the draft federal regulation, it doesn't ever actually get you to zero. And so I think if we're all going to be honest with each other, and the aim here is to drive carbon out of transportation, then you have to look at it from a GHG standpoint and say that your end game is zero, not a ZEV, but zero. And that's where this discussion around e-fuels and other technologies is so important, because if you're going to be able to get to that point, you need affordable, flexible alternatives that are available to people who tow things, who live in places where the grid isn't as robust as others, or where you're living in a remote community where the grid continues to be powered by, in some cases, diesel generators. So I think it's really important for us to say this is climate change is a grave issue. Let's deal with it, and the way to deal with it is to look at greenhouse gases. The other thing I just want to say in passing on the subject of why GHGs went up in Quebec, Danielle's absolutely right. GHG is a function of carbon kilometers driven. So if the fleet's larger, then on average you're going to have more emissions. But something else was going on that was really important at that time. It was something that the Quebec government, I don't think, was tuned into, which was a shift from small cars in Quebec to SUVs.
Yep.
And the result of that was that the average emissions per vehicle were growing. So that was a shift in consumer tendencies, but it was also driven by regulatory changes that permitted that to happen. So that's all I'm saying is, the more complex, the more clockwork a regulation becomes, the greater the likelihood that you end up with unintended consequences. Nobody can argue with zero emissions. That's easily measured, and it gets you to the finish line. But how many technologies you have, how robust the infrastructure is that supports those technologies, and the way that we deploy our raw material development and other parts supply into the creation of those vehicles is all going to be important in terms of getting consumer choice for a wide range of different types of vehicles and at a price point that people can afford.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Karl, I think from your prior explanation, we understand how a synthetic gasoline can produce net zero tailpipe emissions. But how realistic is the mass production of syngas? How efficient is the progress? How much electricity does it need? And can it be used in ordinary ICE-powered cars? More importantly, how much does it cost now to produce a liter of e-fuel? And what are your best projections for the future cost of the fuel you're creating out of thin air?
Yeah, from a technical point of view, it's absolutely realistic. Most of the used technologies are well known. For example, the electrolyzer or the methanol to gasoline process. Methanol to gasoline process was invented by ExxonMobil in the 1970s, so it's 50 years old technology. This is not really the challenge. To produce one liter of e-fuels, we need about 20 kilowatt hours of renewable energy. This is a lot of energy, and the efficiency is not the best, let's say like that. And therefore, we should not do that in areas where renewable energy is short. We should do it in areas where renewable energy is available in abundance. For example, in Europe, renewable energy is not available in that volume we need. And therefore, it makes absolutely sense to use it directly in battery electric vehicles because we have the best efficiency. If you are in that situation, I think this is clear. E-fuels should be produced in regions where renewable energy is available and it's not needed by other industries. We have this pilot plant built together with our partners in southern of Chile. There is no industry, there are no people, there is no use for this energy. And from our point of view, this is the best way to get access to this energy, to do this with a liquid energy carrier. E-fuels, which are able to meet the current specification at the gas station, can be used in every existing car. So you don't have to do any modification, neither hardware nor software. So the car will not recognize whether you use the e-fuel or a fossil fuel. There is no need to change anything. And regarding the production costs, for sure it will remain cheaper to drill holes in the ground and and use the fossil fuel and the fossil energy. but we should also be aware about the additional costs regarding the climate change. And if you add this on the fossil fuel, we are quite sure that regarding the price we pay for e-fuels, we will be competitive before 2030. But the main lever is to get into high volumes, into high scale, and this helps to decrease the costs.
Will it also be important, Karl, to get favorable treatment for the government and not be hit by carbon taxes? I mean, isn't the affordability of synthetic gas dependent on not paying various carbon taxes and all of the other tariffs that are put on gasoline?
So from my point of view, it should be a fair tax. And this should take into account the climate impact and not the CO2 emission, but the climate impact. So a fossil fuel has a big climate impact because it will put new carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. E-fuels will, if we have this carbon cycle, it will not put new CO2 into the atmosphere. And this should be taken into account regarding the taxation for fuel.
Thanks very much. Francis, whatever the increase in electricity demand that EVs will create, how will we produce all that new energy? How much increase will we need every year? After all, to make this work, any new electrical generation will have to be zero emissions. So how much electricity will we have to produce to fill all our green promises, and how are we equipped to make that necessary upgrade?
Yeah, the projections that we've seen, and there's a number of folks that have put together these predictions. But for example, the Canadian Climate Institute is talking about a doubling or tripling of the electricity system. But certainly a doubling of our clean electricity generation by 2050, and we have those two targets, right? The first target is a net zero electricity system by 2035, and then essentially using electricity to decarbonize the rest of the economy by 2050, which brings us to that doubling of our clean electricity generation. Now, doubling the electricity generation by 2050, it sounds like a daunting task, right? Double what we have by 2050. But as I said earlier, like that, the demand increases that we will see from now out to 2050 are going to be gradual. They will be coming online gradually. And also, when you simply do the math, what does doubling mean between now and 2050 in that time frame? Well, it's 3% a year. So like 3% a year isn't daunting, but the trick is we actually have to do it. And we have to do it every single year, and we have to continue to build the system out at that rate and continue with that accelerated rate of roughly 3% a year as the demand increases as we head out. And in terms of David, in terms of what that future electricity system is going to look like, where are we going to get those kilowatts? It's going to be in all of the above future. Right. The only way that we're actually going to be able to produce that much non-emitting electricity is if we kind of go all in on wind and solar and nuclear and hydro and tidal and probably hydrogen and climate and carbon capture and utilization and more transmission to be able to connect all of this stuff, and customer solutions, including rooftop solar and probably some technologies that we haven't even thought of yet. But it will be an all of the above future to be able to get there. But again, this is not a rheostat. We're not going to switch from today to tomorrow, where the entire economy turns on its on its heels. This is going to be a gradual evolution between now and 2050.
I suspect you'd have to be pretty optimistic to think any of our governments will stick at increasing anything 3% per year for the next 20 or so years. But
the good news is the governments aren't building the system. It is the electricity sector, and this is an electricity sector that has for more than 100 years supplied reliable electricity that has been the backbone of our economy. We're $30 billion of Canadian GDP, but we're the first $30 billion because every other sector relies on electricity, and it has been done reliably up until now. But yeah, we're not talking about the government building the system. We're talking about the people that have been doing this for a century, continuing to do what they do and continuing to build it out.
Okay, thank you very much. Daniel, lots of cars have been successfully electrified in the last few years. Range has increased, so have charging speeds. However, challenges still remain. And I'm going to use electric pickups as a metaphor right now. Numerous evaluations have recently posted articles about full-sized electric vehicles not being able to tow trailers much more than 150 kilometers. That's despite them already having the largest, by far, batteries in the business. Even a doubling of batteries wouldn't get us to much more than 300 kilometers. And as just an example of the challenges ahead for a ZEV future, how do we give those specific consumers the towing ability they now take for granted from gas cars?
Well, first, I would like to add something to what Francis just said, because when we're talking about 2050, we're not just talking about the increase in electric cars that will need more electricity. Actually, according to Transport Canada, there'll be 40% more light-duty cars between now and 2050, and the population of Canada most probably will increase between 35 and 45%. So most of the electricity won't go to cars or trucks. It will go to buildings and industry and commercial sites. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Most of the electricity won't go to transportation. Regarding pickup trucks, I think that's a very important question. You have to keep in mind that if we go back 12 years, between 2008 and 2020, the volumetric density for energy for battery electric vehicles increased eightfold. We expect energy density to increase approximately by 100% between now and 2030 to 2035, which means that with a battery the same size, you'll get double the range. Or if you make the battery smaller, you'll get more range because you will have less weight. So as technology improves, it's going to be a lot easier to have battery electric pickup trucks be able to tow anything. That's one thing. The other part of the equation is the fact that if you go back 5 years, a fast charger was a 50 kilowatt charger. Now we're talking about 500 kilowatt chargers and 1 megawatt chargers. And I saw that last year when I was in Norway, because keep in mind that 1% of the fleet in Canada is electric. In Norway, in June of 2022, it was 23%. So there they have a whole area of fast chargers and super fast chargers that already are installed. But as time goes by, we will get closer and closer and closer to a system where we are approximately similar to what a gas station will look like. But we'll be able to charge at home. But when we are on the road, we'll have fast chargers that are going to be a lot more powerful than what we have right now, which will mean we'll need less chargers, more powerful chargers, and more efficient vehicles. If you look at the Ford F-150 Lightning, for instance, it is not a battery electric design truck. It's a gas pickup truck in which they put a battery in. So it has not been designed. So when we see new pickup trucks coming to market, they should be a lot more efficient than this one. But I agree, more work needs to be done to make towing with electric trucks or cars more efficient.
Thanks for that, Daniel. Stephen, I'm going to continue on this theme and use pickups as the example of the challenges facing the auto industry. So let's just say the world doesn't work out quite as optimistically as Daniel says. If batteries will continue to be challenged to provide the towing ability that a truck owner expects, what is the solution? I know that Toyota is already capable of producing hybrid and plug-in hybrids that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But come 2035, even those are going to be illegal. So if it's not batteries or any form of hybrid, what will power the pickup trucks of the future?
So the reality of this is that I believe, and you can see it built into the federal proposal, that plug-in hybrids have a life beyond 2035, but they have a life beyond 2035 if you're using e-fuels. in terms of what you do with heavier vehicles like trucks, whether it's a pickup truck or if you go up to medium or heavy duty, that's where this discussion about other types of options, including fuel cells or direct hydrogen combustion, come into play, because they're a better solution in terms of the weight in the vehicle, and they drive out certain other types of cost from the system. So when we talk about having different technologies for different use, it's not because you have a technology that is fighting head to head with battery electric in order to have marketplace supremacy. It's that different problems require different tools, and lightweight fuel solutions are better in those heavyweight applications than large battery packs, and they certainly will keep the costs down.
So I've got a big, yep, go ahead.
There was a National Research Council report on battery electric long haul vehicles. And I think it would be interesting for people to look at it, because what it showed is that the vast majority of transportation with battery electric long haul trucks can do the trick. And for the 10 to 20% of the difference, it would be most probably e-fuels or hydrogen. But already battery electric truck can do most of the merchandise transportation.
So Danielle, I'm not suggesting that there isn't a role for battery electric in trucking, but what I am telling you is this: the more weight you put in the truck, the less payload you've got. And so hydrogen's a better solution if you're looking to maximize the return on your payload cycle.
I will send you the report and you'll see.
I understand the report, but I'm just telling you, I also know where the cost curves overlap on battery electric and fuel cell. So again, if you try to, if all you got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In this particular case, battery electric's not the best solution for everything.
Okay, good enough. Karl, I've been wondering what to ask you for quite some time about this. I've been excited about this question ever since I got news that you're joining us on the panel. How did you, and by you I mean the German auto industry, manage to convince the European authorities, the most adamant proponents of electrification, to consider synthetic gas as zero emissions, because they've recently changed their regulations? So seriously, how did you do this? And what can we learn in Canada about this, Karl?
Well, I think what we try to do is not to convince someone, but what we did is share information and facts. And with a pilot plant, for at least what Porsche did, we showed that it's possible to produce e-fuels. And we have the feeling that the politicians in the end seem to have understood our arguments. So they did not change completely the regulation, but they added this option for e-fuels. But in the end, we should remember what's all about. It's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it's overall in the transport sector. This is where we should look for. The base for this is to switch to renewable energies, and if we keep this in mind and then look at road traffic and individual mobility, the answer is quite simple. We have to switch to renewable energy and abandon fossil fuels. And in the case of new cars, the focus is still on battery-powered vehicles, also at Porsche. We did not change our mind right now. The challenge here is to reduce the CO2 footprint during the production by increasingly using renewable energy, and also the electricity for the operation of the vehicles must be increasingly renewable. And we are on the way here in Europe, but we are still a long way from reaching our goal. And regarding cars with combustion engines, we have to focus on the use phase and replace fossil fuels and introduce renewable fuels as fast as possible. And what we see is that the transformation to electric vehicles is far too slow to the fleet renewal, which is only 6% per year. And this will take too long to make big steps regarding decarbonization, and therefore we think that e-fuels are a necessary addition, not a replacement, but an addition to the electromobility. And doing both electrification and renewable synthetic fuels, this is from our point of view the fastest option we can do. And to accelerate, we need regulatory frameworks that really accelerate the ramp up of renewable energies and their use, enable the large production volumes and capacities, and make mobility more affordable. And with our approach, we don't just think about our vehicles, but about other transport areas and beyond the transport sectors as well, because e-fuels are not only for cars, for sport cars or whatever, it's also for other transport sectors like aviation, shipping, or the heavy duty sector.
Thanks very much. Francis, here's my last question about Electricity Canada's submission to the government. In it, you mentioned the upward pressure on electricity rates that has not been factored into the official cost-benefit analysis. Now, I'm like most people. Not only do I not understand my electric bill, I have no clue how the rates are set. Could you walk us through a little bit of that, but most especially focusing on how that extra demand of electric cars could affect those rates in the future? And please be gentle. I'm confused enough already about my hydro bill.
Your concern about the complexity of setting rates is shared by many people. But listen, as I said earlier, 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks after our submission on the ZEVs, we had that federal budget that committed $1 out of every 8 in anticipated new spending, specifically to clean electricity and clean electricity projects. And that really does shift the framework considerably when it comes to upward pressure on electricity rates. So, what we'd said 2 weeks prior to the budget doesn't necessarily apply. But, since you asked about how rates are set, so electricity bills, and in a lot of places in the country, they're not called hydro bills. There's many spots in the country where hydro isn't the main source. So electricity bills, they reflect the cost of building and maintaining the system in your area. Those costs are approved by a provincial or a territorial regulator, plus the cost of actually generating the electricity. Now, from your earlier Highway 401 reference, I'm assuming that you're in Ontario, so you may have some additional charges just to further complicate the bill for things like, regulatory charges and global adjustments. But in the main, the rates are set by regulators, and every customer, rich or poor, pays the same rate per kilowatt hour to support that. And so, using federal dollars because of the new budget to fund investments to meet these federal objectives, reducing GHGs, means that at least some of the cost is going to be offset, and we will see some addressing of concerns about affordability. So what the budget is doing is decoupling some of the infrastructure costs as we go forward. The federal government sees a role for itself in helping build out electricity infrastructure, given that the decarbonization of the economy will be achieved through electrification. And this is, kind of similar to what the government has been doing now for a couple of decades with respect to public transit infrastructure. So the same kind of dynamic is at play. So the intention here, but in the end, the intention here is really to address affordability for end customers. So, for example, we've got this new electricity investment tax credit. The government actually ties that to the reduction in price for consumers, so that the dollars that are put in by the federal government are passed on to the consumer. So what that means is that we double or triple the amount of electricity we need. The federal government will be putting dollars into the mix so that all of those costs don't all end up on the bills that customers get each month.
Okay, thanks very much, Francis. I'm going to try a few viewer questions now. Terry, an automotive facility owner, asks, do you feel that the government will change the 2035 date when they realize it's not realistic? I'm going to give this one to you, Daniel, with a bit of nuance and my own question on this. What happens if in 2035, if some provinces, and I'm thinking Ontario, BC, and Quebec here, hit the 100% target, but other provinces like the prairies, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, stay stuck at some low number, say 25 or 30%. What are we going to do at that point in time?
Honestly, I don't know. I'm not in politics anymore. But I think that the fact that we will get more EVs on the market will make the technology a lot more efficient as time goes by. And I mean, from your purely economical point of view, it's going to make a lot more sense. It won't make much sense for most people to buy a gas car because it's going to be too expensive. So to me, the issue is about making sure that we have more cars. If you look at what happened in the UK and Germany, if you go back 3.5 years ago, they were below 5% ZEV sales. Now UK is at 40%, Germany is at 55%. And where we have regulated markets in Canada, Quebec is at 14.6, BC is already at 20%. So I think that obviously some markets will go faster than others, but I think that the technology will make sure that we get to that point. I'm very confident about that.
Okay. I've met some Albertans. They're a lot less confident that the province will go electric, but we'll move on. Steve is curious about hydrogen-fueled ICEs, fuel cell synthetic gas. I'm curious as well. Let's pretend for a moment that our government did get more inclusive with alternative fuels, as long as the cars were genuinely net zero. What do you think the percentage split will be in 2035 between BEVs, fuel cell, hydrogen-powered ICEs, and synthetic gas? Where do you are BEVs still the majority of the plurality? What's the breakdown?
Tough one. That's a tough one, Stephen.
Well, it is and it isn't. I'd like to separate this into two parts. One is the new car marketplace, and one is the used car marketplace.
Yeah.
In the new car marketplace, my prediction would be that battery electric vehicles hold the lion's share of the light duty market. And that's not to say that they're going to be ideal for everybody. And I do also think that the cost of new vehicles is going to rise, because most of the cost of a battery electric vehicle is in the materials content in the vehicle. It's not a labor cost. It's not a technology cost per se, although there's a chemistry cost. It comes down to this question of what does it take for us to get the raw materials that we need processed and then built into components for vehicles that we'll build. And there's a lot of complexity between regulation and also trade policy right now that is forcing the supply chain to ramp at a very hot rate, and it's causing a lot of extra cost. So I think that as we move forward, nonetheless, it's going to be easier for a lot of people to adopt battery electric vehicles into their lives. But that really comes down to how quickly, not only does the electricity supply itself increase, but how quickly the infrastructure, particularly at the local level in towns and cities, improves. People are only going to adopt the technology as it becomes convenient for them to use it. Now, beyond that, I would say there's a very real use case for hydrogen fuel cells and light duty in the fleet space. So, we talk about light duty vehicles in terms of ownership or usership. The ownership model, I think, is going to be dominated by battery electric vehicles. The usership model, there's a lot more space for hydrogen to come into play, because those hydrogen fuel cell vehicles have a much higher uptime cycle. And so in heavy use environments, they work well. And that's why we're doing things like our Kinto lift experiment out in BC. So whether it's that type of ride hailing approach, whether it's courier systems, whether there's any number of other ones where you have to run vehicles 24 hours a day and they come back and are centrally fueled, that's a use case for hydrogen. Beyond that, I think you're going to see increased applications for e-fuels or for direct hydrogen combustion, but again, small percentages in the early stages of this. And that's not a problem. The problem is if you don't allow for that diversity of technologies, because then you're putting all of your eggs in one basket and everything has to work perfectly in order to achieve your outcome. And that's where I think you run the risk of missing your targets in 2035 if we don't have that redundancy built into the system. But if I were betting, my bet would be on battery electric in the new car space. Here's the other problem. Just because we require certain types of new vehicles to be sold doesn't mean that consumers are going to walk away from the used car marketplace. I think the used car marketplace may continue to be dominated by internal combustion vehicles, which is the other reason why it's important for us to have e-fuels in the market, because it's only the e-fuels that will clean up that existing fleet. And none of the jurisdictions in Canada, whether we're talking about the feds, whether we're talking about Quebec or BC, have closed the door to imports of used vehicles. And we're sitting next to a market that's 10 times our size. I think it's a pressure release valve that will be influencing a lot of the years between now and 2035.
Okay, yeah. If they can't get electric vehicles from or gas vehicles from Canada, they can buy them from across the border.
And it doesn't take much to for a vehicle to go from being new to used, is I guess what I would say about that.
Okay, Karl, I got time for one last question very quickly. The EU has accepted synthetic fuels, and I should mention here, in case everybody doesn't know, but yesterday there was an International Automobile Manufacturers Association released a statement that more or less asked that all ZEV mandates around the world allow for synthetic fuel. So, based on the growing acceptance of synthetic fuel. Sort of the same question for you. What percentages of Porsches that will be sold in 2035 do you think will run on synthetic fuel?
Well, I don't know exactly how the percentage will be in 2035, because our strategy is kind of 10 years, not more. But the numbers which we have is that we are aiming for 50% of electrified powertrains in 2025. This is plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles, and more than 80% of pure electric vehicles in 2030. So there is some space left, which mainly for Porsche is the 911. And if regulation allows, and the customer, which is the customers are very important with their demand, if they also like to have combustion engines, we will sell the 911 as well after 2035.
Okay,
and
perfect.
Just one comment regarding the 55% electric vehicles in Germany. This is the whole amount. It's plug-in hybrids, and battery electrics as well. The pure electric vehicles in 2022 were below 20%, and the rest is plug-in hybrids. So we have hybrids or plug-in hybrids with more than 30% of the volume of new cars.
Thanks very much. Well, folks, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I would like to say one thing before we go, and it's this. Everyone on this panel is working hard to reduce the industry's carbon impact. We may disagree on what path is the most efficient to get us to 2035, and we may not agree on what powertrains are best suited to net zero, but the goal remains the same: reduce, if not eliminate, carbon production resulting from the automobile. I hope you found today's discussion as interesting as I did. And that's all thanks to Daniel, Stephen, Karl, and Francis. My heartfelt thanks for making a complicated issue so understandable. Most of all, a special thanks goes out to everyone who joined us for this crucial discussion. And if you enjoyed today's debate, tune in 2 weeks from now as Driving into the Future tries to solve all our traffic congestion problems. Thanks again, and have a good day.